understand that when we try to approach and understand these subjects, this is not somehow occurrences of events that explains, but how would basically we conceptualize the complexities of conflicts and wars and this constant reality that confront us after the First World War, Second World War, and then there was a period of creating an order. That order also what we call the bilateral order. The war and conflict is somehow is a savagery. That's European moment sometimes gave birth what basically imagined by Immanuel Kant, Rousseau, and these people, what we call and referred now as the age of enlightenment. That peace is something is not what we call as we can find and look for, but it is something which is needs to be desired. Since most of you are into the education or in that field, I assume that everybody is at least bit familiar about what's happening around the world. Why it is happening so normalized way, why it is so much kind of a everyday reality. That's something I think I would try to engage here, more than the normal events then where it is happening, which are the actors who are basically involved. But I think I must start with this understanding about that there is a kind of a very profound understanding about that the conflict and war, and sometimes it's basically equaled as one. In sometimes, is there any sort of a timelessness about the definitions? You must also understand that when we try to approach and understand these subjects, this is not somehow occurrences of events that explains, but how would basically we conceptualize the complexities of conflicts and wars and that's constant reality that confront us. And then it basically gives me a very one profound answer to that. That the conflict and war, if I use as a kind of a one nomenclature, it basically defines the human story more than anything else. Nobody remembers 1,000 years ago what kind of society used to live and what sort of a peace mechanism used to exist. But it is the war and the conflict that bequeath us the past when we try to rationalize our understanding, our connections with the past and history. And in that way, conflict and war is our story. It is a human reality, none other than anything you can compare about. But with the timelessness of the definition, sometimes argue there are a sort of a departure at two different levels that we try to understand. What I'll do today is that try to meaningfully construct the flow of this discussions. That whether it is always assumed as the one, whether conflict and war is a deep-seated human nature reality, whether it is structural in explanations, whether it is because of the rise of the nation states, the idea of the sovereignty, the territorial sort of a class, or it is also further security dilemma that sustain and aggravate the states for their own security challenges, and they only can survive if they are forever in war, because that was the only safety guarantee for them. But we also understand these discussions that over the period, the dynamics of conflict and war have evolved dramatically. It is not just about the nation states, or if you go back to the age of empires, or even the ancient history which comes to us from the great strategic thinkers, whether from Sun Tzu in Chinese civilization, Kautilya in Indian civilization, similarly Machiavelli in Western, and Clausewitz later on, which became a profound sort of a contributor in terms of how the war should be strategized. But there are many aspects of also which evolved over the period. And then we know that what really happened after the age of globalization entered. Uh, After the First World War, Second World War, and then there was a period of creating an order. That order also what we call the bilateral order basically means that two great powers are the main actors of the structures of the world. That's basically created the age of the nation states, particularly going after the post World War situations. And then post colonial discussion started when a lot of self determination of countries like India, in African country, they started coming in. So world basically comes as an order in that way. And then we look into that there are different sort of actors try to understand. The war and conflict is somehow is a savagery. That's European moment sometimes gave birth what basically imagined by Immanuel Kant, Rousseau, and these people, what we call and referred now as the age of enlightenment. That peace is something is not what we call as we can find and look for, but it is something which is needs to be desired. The challenge, however, remained with all these discussions and all, with going back to different traditions and cultures, going back to the practices of post Enlightenment, which coming back to the Europe and that created a different sort of world. We know that that did not end. Colonialism happened despite that West went into a kind of a renaissance, enlightenment, and after all. But then the reality of colonialism was also existed. In that manner, if the peace is desirability or a desire, then conflict is a reality. And that between the reality and the desirability, that world that we live in, that is basically explains from where we came from and how we are basically trying to live with this question and confront this sort of a major discussion. I will definitely construct my lecture into at least some sort of a flow chronologically, going back to the earliest period of human history. And then the one most important aspect, which I'll come to that, how to theorize and conceptualize the critical aspects of the conflict and wars, which is basically confronting as a very constant everyday reality to us. But if we come back for a second to the present moment, so that it will be some sort of a setting up the tone of the argument, we know that there is a war going on constantly. Iran, where uh, Israel, United States is basically bombing, and then Iran is basically reversing as a part of a street of a strategy for survival, bombing the Gulf countries, critical infrastructures are bombed. And then what happened that lead to about the international trade navigation at the Strait of Hormuz. Such challenges become a sort of a permanent reality. It is something that it was man-made pandemic. If there was something like what the COVID basically taught us, that human civilization has to come out from this some sort of amnesia or immaturity, that what once in Immanuel Kant referred as that enlightenment is fundamentally is the human being's immaturity. And then we didn't really understood. And then what happened when the Russian-Ukrainian war? If you make a catalog now, each part of the continent, there are some sort of a conflict and war going on, whether in Africa, whether in East Asia, whether in North America, everywhere. So in that way, our current world is full of war and conflict altogether. And particularly in that way, there are different sort of a pattern and behavior in which we basically understand. But as as an educator, we also try to understand that how to basically demystify the complexities, how to basically rationalize the challenges that basically comes, and how to simplify the complexity by providing a very particular sense of concept clarity definitions, and then to basically rationalize with the what's happening in the world. As we know that theories or a concept is not something basically inquire about the certain events which is basically come out from the blue or exceptionals. It is basically a giving us a reality that why certain things really happen. uh, and also it also gives us a sense about that we need to theorize and conceptualize something to adhere to certain norms, universal applications, and principles. That's why we need a definition. That's why we need a clarity, because there is always, as we understand, there is a dynamics of rivalry between the objectivity and the subjectivity. So is the war and the conflict is a subjective or it is an objective reality? uh, just to connect the dots, recently the American president says that he doesn't believe in international laws. If last 60, 70 odd years, the war and conflict is fundamentally defined by whether it is legal or not. There was a period when there was a distinction between just war and holy war. Basically means that the political representatives or the authority, whether it was king or anyone else, used to declare war considered as a basically the just war. And the religious basically we look into whether in the war of inquisitions, in terms of what we also call the crusades, and also there are different, like even coming back to Indian traditions, Mahabharata and all, there were different ideas of war. Some in Mahabharata we call it as a dharma yuddha. Similarly, in inquisitions and particularly in crusades, there is some sorts of the aspects of divinity also present in the idea of conflict, which mirrors to this day when we see the Israel-Palestine conflict. That we cannot say that the understanding of war and conflict in the last 70 years post establishment of United Nations, international laws and all together, that it is the legality which basically defines what is war, what is just war, what is unjust war, and in which manner we should basically understand the challenges and the possibilities. So these are the some sort of a common reality. Now, if I take a some sort of a sort of a chronological reality, I fundamentally divide these discussions into two parts. One is that the age of empires before the age of nation state, where we can trace going back to the earliest time of the human history, and what's the reality of war and conflict post age of nation states that basically connects to the what we European moment or European Renaissance, 1648, what we call the Treaty of Westphalia, that gave birth to the what we call the modern nation state, and the idea of the sovereignty and rationality basically captured the imagination of how the humanity should conduct itself. But if we look into the other flow of it, there are many such sort of argument which basically comes, and that argument basically tells us the timelessness that we try to understand with the conflict and the war is not certain things which we basically can say with certainty. So, for example, if we divide these discussions, how the earliest time of war and conflict was basically conceptualized by the strategist. We have the wisdoms, we have the connections and understanding. That there are 4 5 aspects of conflict and war basically that basically explain in terms of as a concept. First, as I argued, what is the role of human nature that explains and defines the idea of conflict? There are some sort of scholars, basically, particularly in Thomas Hobbes, is one of the most important thinker, basically gives the idea about in the modern times what we call the political realism. A realism is something which basically says that it is the world is an anarchy and the state is the only primary actor. There is no higher authority in the world. So a state is always permanently in war and conflict because it has to survive, because there is no final authority who will basically holds the ground. Where is the end of that sort of a maximization of power that we talk about? So that sort of political realism goes back to the earliest time, that it is the human nature which is has some sort of a very brutish in reality. It creates its own challenges. That's why I argue initially that the conflict and war is not something what we call it is just structural, but sometimes it is not like peace is desirable, then conflict is a reality. In that way, the discussions on human nature becomes one of the most prominent understanding about the idea of war and conflict. If we look into the earliest phase of the, if we take the example of how Cotelier defines the idea of war, how Sun Tzu explains the discussions on war, how Machiavelli explains the idea of war. And if we see that, if in Cotelier we find that there are different types of war, And his basic argument about the conflict and war was that everyone is everyone's enemy, and you cannot survive until you defeat your enemies. In one way, if we look at from our current juxtaposition, we will find this is highly uncivilized. But there was a time where the survivability was the extreme understanding about the life and the how the human civilization grew. So in Kautilya, basically, we say that there are four types of war. There is open war where the countries and that time the empires used to fight with each other. And then there is some sort of a very secret understanding of war. There is a guerrilla style of war. And then there is a war of concealment. Now, it is very important to understand for us also, why do we study these people, which is basically 1,000 years ago, gave us some sort of a what we call that the idea of the statecraft. It is primarily reason because that the cultural reality and political reality are not the same. In human civilizations grew more with the cultural productivity more than the political reality. That's why our emotions are shaped by the culture, even though our rationality is shaped by our politics. And in that way, we sometimes try to understand that no, we need to understand what basically these people were arguing about our civilizational ethos. And in that way, Kautilya becomes a very prominent figure in the current discussions of India's national security, if what sort of a conflict way, what sort of a strategy that India should make. But what was he talking about the conflict and war? It fundamentally he was taking that you can only survive in the world if you assume a reality that nobody is your friend. That's sort of a bottom line that he had. Similarly, in Sunju, if you see in the Chinese way of looking at it, he's understanding that the perception is more powerful than the reality. And in that way, you need to develop the best way to living fundamentally or winning a war is to never basically involve yourself in physically, but you work through psychological warfare. And that's why we see that the Chinese way of handling its war and conflict nowadays basically comes from the art of war, basically, which basically given by Sun Tzu. Similarly, in Machiavelli, we see that peace stay away from the lovers of war and the lovers of peace both. We need to understand that there has to be some sort of a the power is everything. That saves the reality of the modern realist perspective. That the power is everything, and the state has to develop its mechanism so that they will, and that can only be possible if you're always ready with conflict and war. Now, these notions, which later on we always also find in Clausewitz, because he is the one important aspect where the modern European and the American strategy finds its kind of an intellectual source. And his argument was that it's basically about the political aspect. That's why his definition on war by that it is the politics by other means, is the extensions of politics. War and conflict is basically is an extension of politics. And there is some sort of a, what subordination of rationalization, what he talks about. So when we look into that, just to connect with that in the last 60, 70 years of the Americans' war and conflict, you will always find that they had a kind of a very different way to take it up. What we call in sociology and political science, the division of humanity basically means that there is some sort of a conflict and war which become civilized when the West basically tries to do, and it become uncivilized when the non-Western countries do the same on them. That was the exact sort of explanation the George Bush gave after the September 11 attack, which was ghastly in nature. Innocent lives were lost. But what basically he was arguing, he says that this is an absolute astonishing and assault on the civilized world. It just did not say that what they have done in Iraq, what they have done in Vietnam, what they have done in Syria, what they have done in Afghanistan, and throughout the world, across the world, if there is a one common pattern of the modern war, which is a constant reality, it is basically the visible and invisible American imperialistic tendencies in the name of unipolarity or some sort of maintaining that world that only one power can sustain, that hegemony, that what we call in political science, so that this is how the power can function. So in a way that there is a back and forth reality, but then the war, not just about the strategies and the conflict. And then further, I will divide what is the distinction between the war and conflict. I'll come to that point. But the idea of the human nature is very central. When Hobbes basically says that it is basically Brutus in nature, that there is some sort of a interesting reality about human, that we cannot basically get away from our some sort of a despotism that basically surrounds us. So that's why if you understand also the pathology, that what we say, deep seated amnesia in individuals, which they basically go for conflict, because there is some distinction between conflict and war. The war is basically the highest form of conflict, where the physicality has to be very much present. Exception are two. One is the Cold War, where they were basically trying to navigate their warfare differently. And then after September 11, what we call the War on Terror, where there was no sort of very established enemy. So in that way, war and conflict becomes one at one time, when there is some sort of a political violence basically becomes a sort of a connection. But when it differs, it's together, because conflict is basically more or less is explains much wider lens for us. And I'll come to that point again. But that human nature discussion is very central in the earliest major academic inquiry on the question of the war and conflict. Now, one individual who tried to basically navigate it very, exceptionally was Sigmund Freud. Though he was a psychoanalyst, but he did basically talk about the question of war and conflict when he had an exchange of letter with the pacifist and the one of the most important uh, scientist of all time, Albert Einstein. And they had an exchange of letter on the question of how can we come out from this sort of a war and conflict. This is, I'm talking about before 40s. And there sort of an exchange of reality was happening. And in Sigmund Freud's major submissions on the question of why war, and he's basically say that we should not protest, because it is overwhelmingly suggests that war and conflict is a biological reality. It is a certainty that will always be in some sort of a form. And then his major argument were very interesting, that till the age of nation state or the political authority becomes more sort of a prominent, the war and conflict will never get away. And his last submission in that, but why war and how to basically come out from that savagery, was that basically you need to have a cultural development among all the societies that we have, and education becomes the most important tool. In that way, that human nature centric. But then there was also the biologists try to understand the question of war and conflict. And if you look at Azargat's understanding of the war, basically look from the very biological question reality. And he says that it is not state, it is not the structure, but they were always, we find that human beings were killing each other because it is about the survival question. And that way, the biologists also argue that there are some sort of a discussions on about human nature which does not leave us till the 1930s and 1940s, when there was a human nature centric academic discourse started in social sciences. They tried to understand the question of power and interest from that perspective only. After that, there was a separation from the human nature, what we call the structural understanding of conflict and war. And that basically comes from the very interesting aspect. But one important aspect before I come to that, which was very suggested by Hobbes, he said that the human beings basically go for three aspects of war and conflict. One is basically for gain something. If you really have a material interest, if you, or whether country, whether we see in Venezuela, whether it is oil in the Middle East, there is some sort of a material, some sort of a pursuit that lead people to go for it. Earlier it was survival, now it is greed. The survival and the greed connects that some sort of a gain principles. Then he said that the diffidence is also very interesting aspect. Basically means safety, survival. And for that, you need to go for war and conflict because your people will be in danger in that way. And the third, which is most important, which surrounds more in the age of kingdom, and even to this day, where individuals become very paramount, is the question of glory. That the war and conflict brings glory to the nation and the culture and the society. And each one of us have a very poetic sense of justification about getting glorification on the question of war and conflict, because there is some sort of upliftment comes when we say that we have won the war and we have won the conflict, we defeated the enemy. But the rationalization of such thing when it comes to morality question on the question of war and conflict, then it gets defeated. But that still is a very important reality. We always get some sort of a pride, even now, in any sort of a confrontation when India has with any other countries. And it works for each individual in different parts of the world. So that idea of glory becomes very important. So this was the one sort of argument about war and conflict. And then it moved forward the state structures, where it's argument that, look, human nature is always there, but it is basically about the system in which basically we live in. That, in short, basically means that in the age of nation state, the idea of the world is such that basically explains that you always have to pursue your security and through power maximization. What we call initially them as the realists, or basically their argument is that state is the primary actor that looks for conflict and war situation, because that's the only way a country or a society can survive. And they can only survive if they develop the mechanism. That's why we see that majority of the countries which were less powerful try to achieve a nuclear some sort of ambitions, because it is a nuclear sort of a ambition or nuclear weapon is the only permanent guarantee where the irresponsible big powers will not invade you. And the great example is, despite all the logic failed, how the North Korea survived. The North Koreans basically surviving fundamentally because they have the nuclear weapon. One of the reasons that the Iran is in complete chaos, because it was openly suggesting the world that they want to pursue nuclear weapon. And in that way, they want, at their logic, from the realist perspective, no, they are right about it. After all, an Iranian's pursuit of nuclear weapon cannot be different from an American pursuit of nuclear weapon. Until and unless there is a complete disarmament happens at the level of what we call at internationally. Till then, each state will pursue, and the conflict and the nature might change, but that pursuit will always remain, because that's the only permanent guarantee that you will not be invaded in the time of age of nation state. So the realists basically try to understand that it is the self-help, it is the power, it is the maximization of security, and it is the anarchy of the system of the world that the war and conflict is a permanent reality. But then there were some sort of a moving forward approach happened that gives the birth of liberalism. As educator, we also understand the liberalism is basically not all about democracies. It is not just about stability. It is not. It is fundamentally a way of life, and that way of life suggests that through cooperation, through some sort of engagement, through consensus, war and conflict can be reduced. If you go back to the 1648, the age of the Westphalia that started, it comes from that Rousseauian and some sort of a Kantian principle that war is not some going to get and help us. So in that way, the nature of the conflict and war basically comes with that what we call the institutionalism, and that gave the birth of first League of Nations in 1919, after, because it was premature to that time, because the world was not ready for it. Finally, it culminated when the United Nations really became powerful. And through the United Nations, we see then the Third World War never happened, or the major world level conflict did not happen, because there was some mechanism, despite the United Nations has a catalog of failures to till this day. It is a, somewhere say referred as toothless tiger, some sort of invisible and all of that. But to best of them, some of their so contribution have really reduced the war and conflict, at least in a major say. People will say that, and there are a scholarly argument also. Are we better off before the United Nations or not? And the second is, if there was no United Nations, what would have been the course of then the world had would have been in that way. So you see, there was some sort of a challenges between this realist and the liberals argument about it, and they were moving forward from the different sort of idea. Now here I'll take a minute and I'll give a very brief note to that, what basically conflict is and why basically we talk about these discussions. One way I said that there is a distinction between war and conflict. That full scale conflict is fundamentally is a war where the number of deaths, number of casualty, the cost, these are the determining evaluating factors where you can analyze, okay, this qualified into the category of war. But conflict is something very different. If you look at for our, as I said initially, that human story and human reality is what comes from the war and conflict. We have a world basically at two levels. We only look at the world at two levels. One is the question of conflict, and one is the question of peace. Why conflict happens and in which way the peace can be basically achieved. These are the two windows through which basically we try to understand. And all the education, whether it is at every level, try to fundamentally inculcate those cultural or some sort of a political education to students and universities to give you a sort of a world vision that conflict, maybe it is a reality, peace is what should be the pursuit. And in that manner, the conflict and peace basically is fundamentally is nothing but it is basically about the productive forces and destructive forces, the idea of the good and evil, the god and the devil, and also about in terms of the what is might, what is right, what is justice, what is injustice, and what is basically in terms of we can argue that that peace somehow is not just about the absence of conflict and war in that way. When the evolution, I will also try to connect it with that, how the conflict basically studies, try to understand these realities. So between these productive forces and destructive forces, that what the order is created to create some sort of a, why certain conflicts happen. It is fundamentally there is some sort of instability in that order, and that instability happens because there is a economic factors, there is a political factors, and there are many other factors that destabilizes it. So in that way conflict basically look into in which manner the productive forces, whether at the state level, whether in civil society level, whether at university level, or whether through peace education, we can basically increase the potentiality of the productive forces. And then that's the only way to confront why the war and conflicts are reality. But if you take a kind of a very basic understanding of conflict studies, you will find that it has its own sense sort of a chronological history. In short, I will just try to understand. There were different layers of understanding conflict, and that conflict is basically later on, which basically comes from the Norwegian Johan Galtung, and he basically tried to look at the question of conflict and peace at very different level. First, he basically tried to understand that there is an idea of negative peace and there is an idea of positive peace. Now, idea of positive peace and negative peace became a cornerstone of how and which manner the conflict has to be seen and in which manner the war's problems can be confronted. Now, negative peace fundamentally means that when there are And conflict, by the way, as a definition, is also about the incompatibilities among the actors through which the hostility has emerged. And that incompatibilities could be for any reason. It could be historical, it could be psychological, it could be economic, it could be anything. And once you have multiple dimensions about these discussions, then you basically comes to the idea about, oh, this is the region that a conflict. You identify the underlying forces and the root causes of that, but then you also understand that even if we fundamentally understand the causes of it, how we can basically transform it. Then you basically understand the idea of conflict through that notions. It is basically not just absence of war. No, Johan Galtung was a wonderful scholar from Norway, and he used to basically give the example as for the educators. Look, conflict is like, in terms of medical sciences, it is not just the absence of disease, but to create in a body antidotes so that immunity should be grow up. And in that manner, he argues that the peace and the peace process can only be possible if we have the social dynamism and the political realities of those antidotes that basically sustain the question of peace, not just about looking at whenever there is no war, there is a peace. So that aspect also divided at the three levels, what he called the direct peace and the indirect peace, or the negative peace or the positive peace. Where the negative is basically comes from what is the direct war, the hot war, what is happening between Russian, Ukrainian, what is happening between India, Pakistan, India, China, Cambodia, in terms of there is a China, Taiwan, and they're endless. And then there are civil wars happening. In Sudan, there is a lot of other problems happen. And inside we have a Manipur problem, then we have exigency in Kashmir, then you have a problem in the Kaveri disputes. So there was a resource problem also. These basically calls they as a kind of a direct nature of violence that creates a conflict. But there are some sort of a very two important reality, what we call the structural nature of it and the cultural nature of it. And until and unless if we discuss the cultural aspects that produces conflict and the structural reality that keeps sustaining this, we will not find the question of peace. Now, what is structural that he was talking about? It's basically the social ills, the poverty, the inequality, the casteism, the identity, and all of that. And that structural violence that he refers is one of the most core important value with that needs to be basically responded to. His idea of cultural basically becomes very important because it is the culture that provides the legitimacy to violence. In India, still the casteism functions. It is not because we take pride in it, because it is somewhere there is a cultural level, there is acceptability to that. The marriages, social marriages in India is still highly based on the cultures or in terms of identity. These are basically a form of violence which basically comes from the family and leads toward the streets one day, whether in the name of religion, whether in the name of other sort of an identity. But that's basically legitimacy of such kind of structurals which comes from the culture. Until that needs to be done, Galtung said that positive peace cannot be achieved. Now, that between negative and positive, that's basically the first understanding of conflict. And then why, when the institutional mechanism develop, they try to understand the notions of conflict through management, through resolutions, and through transformation. Now, conflict management is basically comes from that you stop a war, you stop a conflict, how to manage it in institutional sense, what the peacekeeping forces do basically. They are managing the conflict or individuals coming. Then there are conflict resolutions that basically happens, what is happening in recently in Iran and Pakistan, in the Pakistan and the Chinese, and they are trying to do something. What we call the conflict as a resolution, where they bring parties to the table to open the channel of communication, have a dialogue within, and try to resolve amicably, if not completely, they find some sort of a resolution. And if the resolution does not happen through mediation, then there are different sort of a form where it can lead to the arbitration and other aspect. But there is a way out to how the conflict can be basically confronted. And finally, the transformation argument is that you can only transform a conflict if you change the structures. And that structure is very important, that what we live here, what we call the system and actor relationship, we believe in a structure, and that structure basically comes from the top. So all sort of a conflict resolutions and management which try to bring peace question is a very top down centric. What is the state doing, what is the high courts and the law and the court doing, that's the only way we can bring peace. But what basically transformation is arguing, that until and unless you bring all the parties or balance between the top down and bottom up, the structures will never change. At the bigger, larger level, if there all the countries will not be given kind of a same respect as what the Security Council permanent members are, then there will always be a forever war. At international level, what we call interstate wars, it will not stop until and unless there is some sort of a reality that each nation state has to be given some sort of a respect as its sovereign reality. But it does not happen. Why? Because we know that international structures are basically works through some sort of a power dynamics, and there is asymmetric power dynamics that exist in that structure. So what basically transformation is suggesting, that if you really want to have a peace, you just not identify the root causes of the conflict, you cannot just look into the recognition of that, whether bringing parties and mediating and all, but you need to change the structure. And that's the only way these scholars basically comes, where one of the another very good scholar, Ladrak, who basically provides the understanding of conflict transformation. So in that manner, there is one important, and then I come to certain cases and explain, so that I will stick to certain time also, is basically comes from the principles of why certain conflicts sustains, why it is protracted in nature. And there was a one scholar, Edward Azar, who gives that it is fundamentally for four reasons. One is because of the identity, one is because of the some sort of a basic human needs, and also the governance and the external sort of intervention. Basic needs still is the one of the most important factor that contributes or creates conflict. And basic needs doesn't mean roti kapda makan, but in terms of the dignity, that is one of the most fundamental thing about, if you really want to peace in society, you cannot live without having a dignity to others which you expect from others to give you. Similarly, the question of identity becomes one of the most fundamental forces of conflict, whether it comes from religion, whether it comes from other sort of principle, historical in nature, racial in nature, all sort of aspect. And identity is still one of the most important contributor to conflict. And only through the some sort of education, you can basically understand that the human beings cannot have a one identity, because it works through different culture. You can change your religion, you cannot change your culture. Somebody lives in Tamil Nadu, somebody lives in Uttar Pradesh, will have a certain different way of life, but it is the education which connects them, and basically could be the custodian from the constitutional mechanism, but it is the education which teaches them how to be civilized to each other. And that education basically reduces the potentiality of identity conflict. Similarly, governance, which is comes from political authorities, how you manages your affairs, politics, economics, society, jobs, gender, public street, in terms of everything that governance basically offers. And finally, the role of the external actors. We know that there are powerful actors which intervene into the affairs of other countries, and somewhere that conflict basically goes hand in hand. So this is basically the major concept discussions and all of that. And if we try to understand, then why certain things are happening gives us a better sort of explanation. Now, if you take certain sort of a current reality, that in legal sense, there is also a different sort of a discussion that whether the conflict and war is a moral question or is a legal question. In the most part of human history, the legality was not a basically point that explains the question of conflict and war. Once the segregation was legalized, slavery was legalized, killing was legalized, sati pratha was also legalized in a one sense among the people. But we know that that was not something it was right. So morality and legality also goes hand in hand in terms of, that's why when Nietzsche critiques the good and evil, that you cannot say that morality is in a very objective manner. It has to be dismantled in that way, though he has a very different critique of it. But in terms of the conflict and war that exists nowadays, basically comes from the larger, whether it is legal or illegal. The war and conflict are other things for that matter, even domestically in that way. So in legal parlance, it does not say war and conflict, it say armed conflict. And they basically works through in the earliest phase what should be the best way to live the war and what should be the conduct of war. That sort of a principles and logic that works. And most of the mechanism you look into, the just war, the unjust war, comes from that sort of a larger discussions on the legal value of it. There are many some sort of Habermas also calls, which recently passed away. He used to say that there is nothing called just and unjust war. This is whether the war was legal or not. But we know that what happens, and I think there is a paucity of time, I've taken a lot, but because one lecture it's impossible, I try to connect a lot of things. What happens if the responsible great powers become irresponsible and says openly that I do not believe in laws, my morality defines by my own sensibility? Now, in that way, the war and the conflict introduces nature with the rise of artificial intelligence, with the rise of the cyber security, with some sort of invisible forces. We do not know that in which manner the war and conflict will leads us towards the future. In that way, the legal question is also contested highly. And in that way, uh, uh, one of the most important aspect I understood. Look at what's happening in the current parlance, and we see that what was the reason for invading some countries, whether in Iraq and all of that, and what happened afterwards. There is a complete rupture. What Canadian had recently said in United Nations speech recently last year, that the world order is going through a rupture. Now, why world order is very important in terms of, because we live in the world age of nation state, and there is an order on which basically that is structure, and each country has works like an actor. And if there is some sort of a disorder happens, there is a definitely some sort of a conflict will come out. Those conflict could be anything, could be political, could be post globalization, could be some sort of a division of technological advancement, and the parity and imparity. There are so many other aspects of it also. So in terms of ways out, in terms of ways out to achieve those sort of what are the ways that we can basically understand in terms of a summary of it, that it is the universal education, cultural development. By the way, one important point I want to discuss here, that since you all of you are from education field, one of the most powerful contributor to the conflict also has been the education. It is two important aspects, nationalism and religion are the two most important contributor into the most of the major conflicts and war in the world. There are other aspects of it. Territory has been the most important, but its legitimacy comes from where? And in that way, the idea of nationalism, which is particularly becomes some sort of a disease at times, in a very Tagorean's way of looking at, it is also a safety valve. If something happens your border, if your state handles your security, you will be in peace. That's the goal, that what United Nations was also established. And at the state level, that's why we create our government for peace and security. But education is highly nationalized, because the rise of the nation state gave the birth of the rise of the modern university. And almost all the education across the world, all the textbooks in all over the world is highly nationalized. You cannot write a critical discussion where certain things wrong really happened by us to the somewhere else. So if there is some sort of a what we call dishonesty among the educators, because we are basically imbibing the given facts which is untrue, in that way education is also not going to resolve conflict until and unless it is apolitical in nature and highly a-religious in its argument. Because in that way, we cannot create what we call the collective morality. And one of the challenges for educators would be, can we have a prejudice in terms of our arguing? Can we critique something like that? In that way, if you really want to understand conflict and peace, go back and reflect your education model. I do in university, you should do in your school, and as somebody who is listener can also try to reflect that Americans cannot basically critique their government. At least they can in some sense. After 1970s, there are many Noam Chomsky like people were never given a prominent space in the mainstream media. Media sometimes becomes a hiding factors for the government. All the government, whether it is authoritarian, whether elected, whether democratic, whether it is dictators and everything. In that way, arguing in that way, respect and constitutional mechanism is something different. But having that critical notion which comes from education also argue that love for the or patriotism doesn't give you some sort of a guarantee to completely obey the nonsense. In that way, education, peace education becomes very important tool, but it has to have a very apolitical in nature. And that also comes in that way that can be basically demystify, disengage that sort of a reality. And yes, we can do that. It is each government tries to do that. That's why they have a lot of public intellectuals. They have a planning commissions, they have a different sort of commissions. They also understand this bureaucratizations of knowledge production is killing individuals and basically bringing us what we call the rise of the hatred industry, and that will lead to a very kind of a street level of conflict, what we see here, and what in terms of Walls used to argue that the world is divided into the three lens. One is the human nature lens, one is the state centric idea of conflict and world, and one is the international. At each level, whenever you try to look at, each things really matter. Now, last point here, take the summary of all the conflict which is happening around the world, and you will find there are some sort of a common sort of a reality. First, it is basically the retreat or the failure of liberal idea. Without liberalism, world cannot work, but it is failing. Democracies are dying. Democracies are producing many kind of ill factors. Electoral authoritarianism is rising populism creating a rupture in the order, and that retreat of liberal ideas and ethos basically giving us more sort of a reality that the conflict and the war going to more going to happen in that sort of a thing. And in that way, the second aspect would be, if we really try to confront these or and try to understand, we'll need to basically restructure the actors, and in terms of how the strengthening, if the liberal idea is weakening, the liberal institution can also be basically cannot work out. There is a rise of liberal democracy, but where is a democracy? Democracy something doesn't mean elections. It also doesn't. It basically argue that each individual within that sovereign idea of a nation lives with dignity and have a say, even if it is not pleasant to other. That's the liberal notion. And even if we say we have a different culture and other sort of an idea, we need to adapt those values. One thing I wanted to share here, to confront is not the way out, but basically there is a moral crisis, what Albert Camus used to say, that our world is basically crisis. is not because of the nation and other. It is basically our own morality, some sort of a differences that, or in some sort of a problem that we have. That sort of thing is very important. So one is that. The second is the big power, irresponsible power, also one of the most contributing factor. We do not want a powerful country, we want an inclusive country. And that inclusivity is a way out through peace education. If you do not have that inclusive approach towards country, you cannot expect that inclusive idea in the world. You can have multilateral, you can have BRICS, you can have SCOs, but that will again become some sort of a next sort of a powerful sort of a multilateral institution, which will do the same thing to the others. So it is somehow, I'll just try to touch on here. When the Hitler said that after when he did some sort of a ghastly act, that when you kill the beast, the venom is over, and something like that. If the venom stays, even after the beast is over, it will create the new beast. So in that way, education has a different way and approaches to add that. We learn from the scholars, we will learn from the historians, we learn from the concepts, theories, different cases, and all put together. As a last point I want to say here, that yes, peace is a desire, and a conflict is a reality, but it is not a biological reality. It is a constructed reality, and if something is constructed, then it can be reoriented also.
So we have a first question here. So is the world at the brink of a third world war?
I think I would say that there was a cliches in terms of that. When Albert Einstein once said that, I do not know when will the third world war happen, but whenever the fourth world war happen, it will happen through the sticks and stones. So that, as a pacifist, he argued that we are already in the verge of many wars, basically. In the age of absolute wars, what we call the total wars, nobody is a clear winner. In the age of AI, in the age of cybersecurity, in that way, you have seen that despite everything is lost by Iranians, they still survived because they have the mechanism. There are many states who might not, like Venezuela and others might not. But in generally, if I may argue about the question of the third war, do not even think for a blink of eyes. Even in your bad dreams, cannot imagine what devastation it would cause. Because the Second World War was not basically gives us in terms of that the amount of the technological advancements, in terms of the in terms of the challenges that comes out from the nuclear and the post-nuclear and other activities. We are in the age of crisis. We are not expecting the third world war happen. If it really happens, that will definitely be the end of humanity. And whether the Einstein said that we are ready for the fourth war with a stick and stone, I'm not very sure about, because when Einstein was alive, he did not see that the rise of AI. Because one thing just wanted to add, Nicey, just for a second, that in human history, the past 1,000 years, whatever we have developed through knowledge, through AI, we are basically can get it in basically an hour. So in terms of, you can understand that in which speed that the technology is basically confronting us, and in which manner the nature of the third war would happen. We're not very sure, but it would be a kind of the very last thing that any human person should aspire and think of. Yes.
Yes, thank you so much for that. So can we say that Israel-US strike against Iran is a Dharma Yudh?
Um, I think no war is a religious war in terms of, because any religion will not be. See, even if you say it's a dharma yudh, uh, even if you say that if you are a very hyper pro-Israel, or if you are a hyper in terms of Zionist in that way, how could you seek pleasure of 180 school children, girls, killed by bombs and all of that? If it is a dharma yudh, I don't think that the any god and the any dharma will be pleased by seeing that sort of a devastation. So this is needs to be seen in that way. The idea of dharma is very important. What Vedavya said about dharma, that you cannot expect what you do not want to see for you. That is dharma. So it can be a dharma yudh if the Israelis will face the same thing and they don't have any problem with. Can we say that they will be ready for that? The answer is no. A dharma basically means that the highest level of morality which you cannot expect what you see for yourself and you do not deserve. So in that way, it won't be a dharma yudh. It is basically stupid war, which is basically. And by the way, I have been to Israel many times, and they have a great contribution, particularly in terms of science and tech. But it has a very some sort of a country which is very paranoid because they cannot survive in war forever. Even though their national security is all about war is a permanent feature for a survival of Israel, but then it is a paranoid state. How long you can survive in a war? 50 years more, 60 years more? But then that's not somehow eventually will lead towards any sort of a peace. They also have to find the ways out. So I think it would be absurd to call it a dharma yudh.
Yes, thank you so much. Sir, Ayan Ali has asked a question here. What is the scope for peace studies given the heightened threat perception, strategic distress, and a return to the Hobbesian state of nature?
I think it's a kind of a global challenge. I mean, it's not just very stick here; it is everywhere. As I said, that each nation and the government try to make everything very from a nationalist point of view, which eventually will lead to some sort of a very so and finding glory to that also. That will definitely lead to some sort of a very Hobbesian world where you will always look that everybody is everyone's enemy, and man is a permanent state of war in that way. My understanding here would be that what Freud said to Einstein, that we need to create that cultural development, and if the universities, the schools are not based, are the custodian of that, if they are not doing their role, even half, 50%, then definitely we are into the Hobbesian world, because you can't expect the structures without basically changing the actors. So what is the one thing that individuals do in a country? What the happened in Poland, or there are many other some things which happening. But I'll make a point here. There is nothing absolutism about replacement until unless if you change the structure, and the structure is not going to change just because somebody is wishful thinking. I might say the best of the words here. I might not have a much power to basically undo that. But what I can do to provide a political education to the shared way so that we are basically mindful that what we are doing. So in that way, in a very short, it is a very difficult way to analyze in which eventuality will it really happen, a vision order or a perfect order, but definitely we should do our part.
Sir, there's one more question from Suman. Sir, in the last part of the session, you mentioned that education also plays a key role in terms of war and peace. So, should we neutralize the concept of nationalism and religion to avoid extremism?
I think it's a very difficult question because, see, the reason is that our education tells us to be rational. Our families are telling us to be still very emotional. And basically, our family values, society comes from the idea of religion, culture, some sort of a ideology. And our education tells us to be very rational, very sort of a critical, very sort of a scientific. And there is a mismatch, and because of that mismatch, there is a permanent conflict in each one of us. So, what I can also argue that how to rationalize your rational thinking, and it can only happen if you revisit what you basically believe in. If you believe in that your religion is the final truth, then it will lead towards some sort of a rivalry, because religion is always be understood from an ideological lens. If you really want to be stay religious, look into the philosophy, avoid the political nature of it. Same goes with some sort of a politics. If you really want to be in politics, see the ethics and the larger goals. Avoid the ideological sort of a bandwagoning. So in that way, it is very difficult. But yes, I think it's a process through which, last point, what the world really used to happen in 100 years ago. There was a time when what we are discussing would not have been imagined. So in a very John Lennon famous song, imagine, he was also a pacifist and a peace, that there will be a time, there will be a world. If we are a pacifist, if we are a peacemaker, then we can really look for the future that it might come to us in a much better way, which were, but we need to imagine that, and we need to have to develop that thinking in that way. Yes.
Thank you so much, sir, for that. Um, shall we take up one more question, sir? Is it okay?
I'm fine. I'm fine.
Yeah, okay. So, sir, see, you mentioned the importance of peace education, right? But how do we implement it in schools and colleges?
I think the most important thing about any peace education is it is a universal goal, and that any universal goal basically comes from that, that you basically you use the education as a kind of transforming the society, not basically creating the herd mentality. Don't bring quota factories into your schools. Make them believe that they are schools are basically are the building blocks of peace, build peacemakers in that manner. So if you force them individuals, the very Darwinian idea that survival for the fittest, those who only take 99% should be get rewarded, others should be left out. It's like a family which does not look into the weaks and only glorify the strongs. So in that way, peace education has to be universal, it has to be ethical in conduct, and it should not be based on the principles of the glory or the, who is the best or not, but it has to be inclusive in nature. And no government, at least in a democracy, forces you to believe otherwise. And if it is saying otherwise in different parts of the countries, different parts of the world, then as a moral rational person, you should not abide by in terms of its completeness.